So this video is about the academic writing process. So probably if you haven't taken academic writing before, you're not super familiar with the way that this process works. There's several terms that you might not have seen before, such as topic, theme, thesis, statement, claim, brainstorm, open-ended, dry sense of humor, relevant, obvious, palette, and flesh out. So the terms on the left are going to be key terms in the class, and you'll see them taught in a lot more detail in some of the other videos. The terms on the right are English terms that we're not sure that you would know. So open-ended means that there is no decided answer. Dry sense of humor is a type of sense of humor, type of telling jokes, that involves a lot of sarcasm. Relevant means that something matters, that it connects to what we're talking about and dealing with. Obvious means that something is easily known or well known. A palate refers to both your tongue and the ability to taste or like something. And to flesh out means to do something in more depth. So let's move forward. So in this presentation, we're going to look at the steps that are basically involved for an academic writing class, for a final paper in a Western context, for graduation theses, master's theses, doctoral theses, and also for academic publishing. Now, it's a very lengthy process if you do the entire thing. So I'm going to explain all of the process, and you may not have to do all of the process depending on the context that you're in. So I'll just read the steps out, and we'll look at each of them in more detail. Selecting a topic, identifying key themes in the topic, producing a thesis statement, developing the argument for the thesis statement, outlining the paper based on the core argument, drafting the paper, revising the introduction and conclusion, and finally editing the paper. So selecting a topic is one of the hardest things to do in academic writing. It's part of an open-ended paper writing process. So if you are an academic, you'll often have to do this. If you're submitting to a paper, you have to pick the topic, you have to do everything. If you are taking a university class, you often don't have to do this. In most classes, the course name decides the basic topic and the instructor specifies further. So if you're taking an anthropology class, you're not going to be writing about chemical reactions that have nothing to do with people. If you are taking a science education class, you're not going to be writing about Spanish. The goal of this part is to narrow what you will write about. So topic is the biggest category of all the things that we'll be looking at, and you'll see it in more detail in the PowerPoint presentation. That's the next flip. Next step, to identify key themes. So within a topic, there are themes and terms that are relevant. These are the ideas that are used when we talk about this topic. So these frame the academic discussion around the topic. Here you want to think about which of the themes interest you the most and how different themes interact with each other. So if you're studying, for instance, race or gender, you might want to look at power constructs. If you're studying chemistry, maybe there's a particular element that you really like, the colorful bonding that it does, or you want to understand the high energetics, so the large explosions, other things that it can do. Maybe these are some of the themes, say, for nitrogen chemistry or things like that. Brainstorming themes. So when you're at the theme stage, it really helps to brainstorm. Now, to come up with relevant themes, I find mind mapping to be one of the most helpful brainstorming techniques. The goal is to write down as many related ideas as possible. Just write as much as you can and then work on connecting them. So there will be a later PowerPoint that shows you how to go about doing this. For now, I just want to show you the skill that it is, the skills that are involved in writing, and you can work through them on the other PowerPoints when you want more in-depth training. So let's think about a topic. So let's say we pick the topic of British culture. So spend a few minutes to write down all of the themes you can thinking about British culture. So since this is a flipped class, you can just pause the video and you can spend maybe 3 minutes working on this, but I'm going to keep moving forward. So you might come up with things like British film and television, the shows Sherlock, Downton Abbey, Doctor Who, British humor, things like Monty Python and Mr. Bean, differences between British English and Canadian English or American English, things about British food such as afternoon tea, fish and chips or trifle. All of these are things that might come to mind. Okay, so here I want to look at the next step, which is how to produce a thesis. So we've already got a topic, that's the broadest category. We've looked at the themes in that topic, and now we need a thesis, or a thesis statement. This is going to be the task of saying something new. So the themes for most topics are obvious. So we had like British food, British English. These things don't require very much thought to come up with. When we have things that are that obvious, they're not going to make an interesting paper. So in order to make an interesting paper, we need a thesis statement. And this is a basic concept of Western academic writing. It should always say something that's interesting. And by interesting, we mean something that can be argued and something that must be argued. This means it is something that is not well accepted. So we'll look at all of this in a lot more detail in some of the other flips. But for right now, I just want to lay out the pieces in the paper writing process. The goal here is to produce a statement that tells us something interesting about one of the topics, or about the relationship between multiple topics together, or themes within a topic. Either is okay. The goal here is we need to say something that must be argued and that can be argued. After you have the topic and the theme, you're going to have to brainstorm to come up with a good thesis. They don't just pop out of nothing. There are several techniques that you can use to find a good thesis, but one that I like is to free write. So before I suggested that we use mind mapping to come up with themes. But for coming up with a thesis statement, I suggest you try free writing. This just means that you write and you write and you write, and you try to make something that fits all of the parameters. So again, in a later flip, there will be more details on how to use these sort of brainstorming techniques to help your writing. So write the same thought in slightly different versions, several versions, and then pick the one that you like the best. Important things to think about. Pick something that you would like to write and that others might like to read. Pick something that is a proper statement you can defend with an argument and something you can complete. So if you're writing a term paper for one class, don't pick something that's going to take you 1,000 hours of research to do. You don't have 1,000 hours for one class in a semester. So in a later flip, we'll look at what the word statement means, but for now, just understand you want it to be a proper statement you can defend with an argument. So let's use our example of British culture, and let's move from the theme to the thesis. So in our example, we said things like British film and television, British humor, British English, British food. Sample thesis. The dry sense of British humor exists to compensate for the reputation for bland food. Here's a question. What makes this a good thesis? First thing, it's a statement. So I know you haven't learned this yet, but a statement is something that must be true or false. So either it is true that the dry sense of British humor exists to compensate for their reputation for bland food, or it is false. Second, it must be argued. This is not a claim that most people accept. So if you wanted to argue this, you'd have to show why. Third, it's interesting. This is something that if you say it, it will give a reaction. Maybe people will think, oh, you can't say things like that, or maybe people will think, that's pretty funny, that's a great idea. Another good thing about it, it connects multiple themes. So we are tying together British humor and we're tying together British food. So by combining these two things, we're going to make a more interesting paper. Once we have a thesis, the next step is that we need to develop the argument. So it should not be hard to come up with interesting statements that help to develop this argument. The hard part is to show how you will argue for the thesis statement with these things. On the most basic level, we have a 5-point pattern in Western writing. And that 5-point pattern is this. You have a thesis, you have supporting claims, and these supporting claims are things to answer weaknesses that people might think of for your thesis. And then finally, you may need to add what we often call a hook, something that explains to people why they want to read your paper. So, thesis, the dry sense of British humor exists to compensate for the reputation for bland food. Weaknesses in the thesis. So you can think for 5 minutes and you can come up with any of the sort of weaknesses that you can think of. Now, I've already given them to you, but if you want to, just pause the video and think of some on your own. Is British food actually bland? If so, was it always bland? If not, did it become bland before or after the invention of British humor? Does British food actually have a reputation of being bland? Who thinks so and why? Is a dry sense of humor different from other types of humor? Is British humor dry? Are there other common explanations for British humor? Even if British humor is dry and British food is bland, that doesn't mean we've proved our connection. So our thesis has to connect the two. Moving on. While we're developing it, we want to write a short argument. Now, each of those supporting claims should address a potential weakness in your thesis. Your thesis must be argued because it's not a well-accepted fact and you're taking a side. In other words, some people will disagree with your thesis. This means you need to address. We could also use the word answer or rebut, meaning you need to push back against their objections, doubts, and critiques. And you need to think of that when you're writing the paper. To answer these, you need to guess what those objections are, and you need to fill in the argument so that those things will not break your paper. So weaknesses in the thesis. One we could use, is British food actually bland? Second, are there other common explanations for British humor? Third, even if British humor is dry and British food is bland, have we proved that there's a connection? So if we wanted to do kind of this short 5-sentence version, we'd end up with something like what we have on the right. The dry sense of British humor exists to compensate for the reputation for bland food. First, British food is actually bland. Second, the style of British humor cannot be blamed on the weather. Third, several experts on British culture have connected certain jokes to the British palate. So this is the sort of short version of the argument we would need in order to defend our main claim. So although developing the argument can give us one paragraph is not a full paper. Now, we haven't proved any of these things yet, so I'll just read this. Moreover, we have not argued and proven most of the claims we need to support the thesis just by stating them. So now we need to take our argument, that short version, and convert it into a structured outline. Writing an academic paper will take time, and we need to divide it into small steps that we can do. So for instance, right now I'm writing a paper I've been working on for a year. There's no way I can remember everything in my head, so I have an outline and I fill in the pieces as I do the research to back up the claims I'm making. So this is the basic idea. We're going to take that short 5-sentence version and we're going to expand it in a way where we can fill in pieces as we have time. So a basic Western paper has this structure. There's an introduction, there's a first claim, there are supporting claims. So again, second claim, supporting claims. Third claim, supporting claims. Finally, there's a conclusion. It's important to understand how this works. First, when we say introduction and when we say conclusion, these words are sometimes used incorrectly by Japanese students. Sometimes they will translate concepts like joron and maigaki to introduction, or matome, or a Japanese style of ketsuran to conclusion. This is not the right concept. So in a later flip, we're going to try to help you to understand these things better. So the introduction in our version is a short summary of the argument in present or future tense. So it says something like, in this paper I argue that, or in this paper I will argue that. The conclusion is again a short summary of your argument, but this time in the past tense. So I have shown, or the paper has shown. This sort of language switch is important, because in the introduction, we haven't made the argument yet, but in the conclusion, we have already made all of our argument. So we should have proved the things we were hoping to. So again, this claim should be the conclusion of the subclaims. And this claim contributes to the introduction and contributes to the conclusion of the entire paper. So there's a very simple image that can help us understand this, which we'll see in a couple. Let's look at a sample outline. So we have here on the left the same sample short paper, the same summary that we had earlier. If we look now at what we have on the right, we can now divide that into an introduction, the claim that British food is bland, the claim that humor is not from the weather, the claim that there are expert connections, meaning there are experts that draw this connection, and finally a conclusion. So now we flesh out each of the main points in the argument. So to do this, we will need to support each of these points with multiple claims. So for instance, the premise that British food is bland. We can find support for this. 1. In the past, British people had to ration food during a war, meaning that each person got a portion decided by the government. 2nd, there was also a lack of spices at the time, so people could not add flavor to their foods. 3rd, there's a general lack of interest in flavor compared to some other places. So what else goes into the introduction? The other thing you may want to put in your introduction is a hook. In addition to your statement taking a strong position. Moreover, you should explain what this problem is that you are addressing and how what you're writing solves it. Finally, you should give that short summary. You should give that outline that explains what will happen in the rest of your paper. What goes into the introduction? In this case, we need a thesis statement. We also need the main claims from the paper, and we can have a hook. In this case, my thesis statement is Rurouni Kenshin is the best way to introduce Japanese culture to foreigners. The hook is this. Many parts of Japanese culture are hard for foreigners to understand. The supporting claims are that the manga is better written than many other Japanese manga. 2nd, the story clearly shows the contrasting and changing values in the Bakumatsu and Meiji periods of Japan. 3rd, the characters showcase traditional Japanese clothing and regional dialects, so they use different ways of speaking, and this helps us to understand what's going on there. So this is an example of a good introduction. So it summarizes the argument, it explains why we care about the argument, and it tells you the claims we're going to use to support our statement. After you have completed fleshing out the outline, you should be able to write the paper quickly, because you just look at the outline and you write sentences that match what you wanted to say. The goal here is to draft the paper in structural units. So I'll give you an image that should make that a lot easier to understand than the words. The thesis and the basic argument should be in the introduction. Then each supporting claim gets its own section. Finally, the conclusion should mirror the introduction, meaning it's the same idea, but as I said before, present or future for the introduction, and past tense for the conclusion. So this is the idea. So these are Russian dolls. Actually, in this case, these are Polish dolls. But the biggest one has a thesis supporting claims. The next smaller one has a smaller thesis supporting claims. And the smallest one has a thesis and supporting claims. The thesis of the small one is a supporting claim for the big one. And we just keep moving up. So each of these is a structural unit. From the smallest thing to the biggest thing, the same pattern. We have an argument with a conclusion, we have a thesis statement, and we support that thesis statement with other claims. So this is the pattern we want to follow for everything. So I'll give you another idea of how this works. So if we're writing a one-page paper, then the first paragraph is going to be the introduction, and we'll have 3 supporting claims which will each be a paragraph, and there will be no kind of middle level. And the smallest thing will be 1 sentence, and we'll have probably 4 sentences or so for each paragraph. If we have a 2-page paper, we'll have sections, and then we'll have a 1-paragraph introduction, 1-paragraph conclusion, and in between probably 3 paragraphs each for each of the supporting claims. If we have a 10-page paper, we're going to split it into sections. We're going to have 2 to 3 paragraphs for the introduction, 2 to 3 paragraphs for the conclusion, and we'll write 2-page miniature papers for the middle level. So they'll actually just jump in. So we'll go from the 10 to the 2. So each of the supporting claims will be a 2-page paper inside of a 10-page paper. And again, within the 2 pages, we're basically doing the same thing with a 1-page format, only smaller. This is the basic idea. So revising the introduction. So when you write the actual paper, you might change your mind about the claims, the subclaims, the structure, or the thesis itself. This is why you can't just take your initial draft argument and put it in your paper, because you might change your mind. So the goal of revising the introduction is to correct changes to the basic argument and write this as the introduction. So these changes provide good information for your introduction. So let's look at the earlier paper about Britain. So in our initial outline we had introduction, British food is bland, humor is not from the weather, expert connections, and conclusion. Based on the research that I did, I learned several things. First, I learned it's not that British food is bland, but that there are reasons British food appears bland. So we have to change the second claim. Third claim, there's actually several people who think the dry sense of humor is connected to the weather. So this is the opposite of what I thought. Fourth, there are experts that connect weather and humor. So when we're writing a paper, this is the sort of change we have to get used to. So I'll show you what happens to the introduction in the next slide. The dry sense of British humor arises from the weather rather than the food. First, while I myself did not know this before researching this paper, British food is not actually bland. This is a common misconception based on recent events. Second, the style of British humor mirrors the weather in several important ways. Third, several experts on British culture have pointed out how British comedy is funnier on rainy days and in seasons of bad weather. So based on your research, you may need to change your paper. This is what academic writing is about. Finally, you're going to need to edit the paper. So any paper that takes time to write will be inefficient compared to the outline. So by inefficient, I mean there are extra sentences that don't connect, or there are sentences that are important but are not a part of your argument. So many non-native speakers think the key to writing good English is grammar. This is not true. The key to writing good English is structure. So if you understand this structure, even if your grammar is pretty bad, we can still read your paper, find it interesting, and understand it. If your paper lacks the structure, it's not going to be interesting no matter how good the grammar is. So the goal at this step is to check the paper against the outline and make sure they match. You're going to check whether the structure matches the outline, whether the argument adds up to your conclusion. So the point is that you don't want to have any new information that was not in the premises. So thank you for listening to today's flip. I hope that you find it useful. If you think I'm talking too fast, one thing that you can do, which is really great about YouTube, is that you can slow me down. So there should be an option near the bottom that looks like a gear, haguruma. If you click that, you can change the speed of the video, and that will make it easier to understand. Please comment, please ask questions. The way a flipped class works is that the lecture is done outside of class, but that means if you have questions, please bring those to class and please ask your instructor. I hope you're having a good day or a good night. No matter what time it is, I do hope that you are well.